Okay, I am going to start. Well, again, happy Tuesday, everyone. Great that you could make it, even especially if you're in Europe with this very hot weather. But yeah, today we have a talk by Nicolas Stoll from the Foscari University of Venice in Italy, and he'll be talking about the chemical impurities in the microstructure of polar ice. So I think that's a very nice topic for today. So about today's seminar, especially if you're new here or haven't been here before, we start with some welcome and announcements. That's what I'm doing right now, followed by Nico's talk of around 30 minutes, and that is followed by a moderated Q&A. So you can send your questions to the chat. If you want to stay anonymous, you can send them to our questions at Paleobricks host, who today is Ahana. And Nico has also agreed to stay for tea time. So if you want to have a bit more of an informal chat with him, or if you want to ask maybe some more in-depth or technical questions, feel free to stay after the talk. That part of the talk is not recorded, so yeah, there's no pressure from that side. So some Paleobricks housekeeping. Before we start, Paleobricks values the participation of all folks interested in the paleosciences. So please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. Also, please keep yourself muted during the duration of the talk out of respect for our speaker. And like I said, you can ask questions by chatting to the questions at Paleobricks host or by sending them in the chat. If you want to actually ask the question verbally, you can also use the raise hand function and we will then unmute you. Any technical issues, you can also contact the questions at Paleobricks host for that. We also have closed captions built into Zoom. You can use the CC button to either show or hide them. And then finally, Paleobricks works because we have so many cool early career researchers that are willing to give a talk here. So if you know someone who could give a cool paleo-related talk, or if you want to present yourself, we also accept self-nominations. Please go to the link here. This link will also be dropped in the chat shortly. And we would also really appreciate it if you would fill out a weekly feedback form. This is just for us to get some demographic info as to who is attending these talks. This is completely anonymous and optional, but again, it would be very useful for us. And this is also dropped in the chat. Then enough about us and a bit about today's speaker, Nicolas Stoll. Nico did his bachelor's in earth science at the University of Tübingen in Germany, followed by a master's in marine earth sciences at the University of Bremen. He then did his PhD at the Alfred Wegener Institute, short AWI, in Germany. He did several postdocs in Italy, the US, Germany, and in Denmark, and he is currently a Marie Curie Skłodowska postdoctoral fellow at the University of Venice. And his next step, which he already knows, is the head of the Helmholtz investigator group, again, that's the AWI Institute. And with that, I would like to invite you, Nico, to start your talk. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. Thanks in general for having me. I'm very happy to be here today. I'll share my screen and I hope everything works fine. Okay, you should see my title slide now.
Yes, looks great.
Very good. Cool. Yes. Yeah, again, thanks for having me. I'm an earth scientist by training, but today this will all be about polar ice. So I'll give a rather broad overview, I hope, about polar ice cores in general. And then what I do, I won't focus on one specific study or one paper or something, but a bit more about several things that I've been working with and some open questions. And I hope to give you a good overview about this and maybe also show you where we will heading in the next years. So this is not a full thought out lecture all the way through, but this is more a bit of a way to get you thinking, maybe to see what's currently happening. Good. So first of all, we're going to the poles. So this is an image from Antarctica. I've been on an expedition here a few years back, and on the right-hand side, where those few people are joining us, this is Antarctica, a big ice shelf. And of course, with climate change, Antarctica and also Greenland, the other big ice sheet from our planet, is having trouble. So we can see an increase in, for example, mean surface temperature. Ice sheet mass loss is also increasing on both ice sheets now, and glaciers are speeding up all over the world, not just on the ice sheets, but of course, these big ice sheets hold the vast amount of water and therefore having a big impact on global sea level rise. But we can drill ice cores through those ice sheets, and they can really serve as a paleoclimate proxy in many, many ways. And I'll try to show you not the most important ones, but the probably most widely used ones. Very briefly, but first I wanted to show you this little video of how it looks like when you drill an ice core. This is in Greenland at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's always sunny. It's actually a day like this, so summertime in Greenland. And just to give you a brief impression how it looks like, you can see the cable here pulling up an ice core drill, which is roughly 3 to 4 meters long and contains an ice core, if you're lucky, of also 3.5, maybe 4 meters, depending on what you aim for. What you can see here, I'll just show it again, is this is drilled, this is put on a sledge, so you can move it around. But of course, for the deep ice core drillings where we want to go back very far, we have to do this a little bit different, but the general setup is the same. And for the project I've been mainly involved in, the Iskra project in Greenland, we had a little trench here. So this is roughly 8 meters below the surface. We had a cave system, and this vertical thing in the middle is the ice core drill rig or tower. And you can tilt it, then you can drill a few meters, you pull the entire core back up, and then you put it down, and then you can take the core out. So this is how it looks like in the trench. This says always about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius in Greenland here. And when you get your core out, this is what it looks like. Very important. You can see the arrow on the wall. This is the most important thing. Always know where top is, so your ice sheet surface. Otherwise, you might flip climate history on its head. And that's something we definitely want to avoid. Why do we look into ice? Of course, there's a lot of information in ice, and just very briefly, we have snowfall on the glaciers, on the ice sheets, and at a certain depth, we have air bubbles closed in the snow and then later in the firn. Firn is the transition zone between snow and ice. And we have a constant exchange of the atmosphere. And at a certain point, there's so much snow on top that there's just no exchange anymore. And therefore, we can really look at bubbles, at air bubbles with CO2 information, for example, from the past in those ice cores. They are trapped in the ice, as we say. And the deeper you go, the older you get, usually. And this is the very basic principle of ice cores, that you have a really good climate archive of air bubbles, but also of different things, for example, chemical impurities. So here's an image of layers in the ice. This is a dark field, method called dark field analysis. And the more brighter the spots are, the more impurities are in the ice and reflecting light back towards us. So you can see bands and layers of dust particles, for example. These plots are a bit ugly by now, but you might have seen them somewhere. These are very famous plots of the Epica ice core going back 800,000 years. So from the left to the right, we go from today to 800,000 years ago. And with this ice core, we could really clearly show that there's a coupling between the temperature and the CO2 content in the atmosphere. It's really nicely visible here, and this is one of the core things that we can get from ice cores, because we can really look into those bubbles from 800,000 years ago and analyze CO2 content, for example. To reconstruct the temperature, we use a very basic principle, which uses stable water isotopes. And here are examples from different spots in Greenland. That's the lower line on the right-hand side. And then the longer line are different spots in Antarctica. And you can really get specific values for stable water isotopes, and they correlate with the temperature. It's quite a linear relationship. So this enables us to go into the ice, analyze the stable water isotopes, and therefore we have a climate proxy of the past. It's of course much more tricky and complicated in reality than just this linear function, but I won't go into depth here. Okay, another thing we can see in ice cores are these thick layers. This is the volcanic eruption from Iceland 55,000 years ago. It's really thick, so it's not very common that you see those very thick layers. But this was found in the East Group ice core, and this was probably an eruption that covered Greenland in a few centimeters of ash. And this is an absolute age marker, so we find those layers in different ice cores at different depths. And once you date them, you can always correlate different cores with each other, giving you an absolute depth, because usually you count layers in the ice, which show you the relative depth with a certain error, of course, but it's very good to have those age markers. Okay, but I'm looking into the microstructure, so now we go even deeper. And this is, if you really zoom in into the ice, this is where we are on the microstructure scale. So those thin black lines are grain boundaries in different ice crystals, which are touching each other. So roughly every snowflake is an ice crystal at a certain depth. And we can analyze the shape, the size of those things as we do in classic geology. And we can also analyze bubbles and clathrates. So at a certain depth, those air bubbles get squeezed into the ice lattice because there's just so much pressure. And then we call them clathrates. And they are also visible and sometimes make those funny shapes like the smiley face on the bottom right here. Another thing that's quite important is the so-called crystal preferred orientation. So we have our ice crystal, and there's one major axis. This is really from structural geology. And depending on the pressure and the deformation going on, those orientations, they can change. So this is indicated by the different colors here. And if you look into your ice core, you can actually see this. So the upper example is very shallow, a few 144 meters, and the depth, the deeper one is from below 2000 meters. And you can see the change in color, which we can really see with our eyes. And the more the colors are the same, the more similarly the grains are orientated, and they align with depth usually. And this is, for example, a setup in Greenland where we did some analyses in the field for weeks to months, and we make thin sections out of the ice. You can see this here, 300 micrometers, and then you can really analyze every single crystal in there and look at its orientation. Okay, now the impurities, of course, they come from the surface. So there are several processes that bring chemical impurities to the ice sheet, different deposition processes, wind drift, of course, all kinds of things. But what I'm more interested in is what is happening with those impurities in the microstructure of the ice. So all those interactions when those crystals change in size, in shape, in orientation, for example. So this part here. There are some effects which are direct effects. So you have your atom lattice, and then if you have an impurity, it can really substitute another atom, or it's somewhere in between the lattice, which makes the entire lattice a bit more unstable. Or, which is probably more common, is that our grains, they try to grow. The deeper you go in your ice sheet, the larger your grains get, because there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of time for them to grow. But with those impurities, for example, dust particles, they hinder this grain growth and therefore change how those crystals behave, which again has an impact on the ice flow, on the deformation. And you can imagine this here. So all those crystals are, of course, 3D structures. And if these movements that you can see here are clustered with a lot of heavy particles, those movements would be different. This is very simplified, but it's a similar idea that we have in ice. Yeah, and this has already been known for 40, 50 years, but it's still very tricky to really get down to the basics, what is really happening in the ice, because it's so tough to look in situ into the ice. You always have to drill it, take it out, take it to the lab, and then you, of course, lose some information. So, a colleague of mine, he put this very nicely together. It's a bit of chicken and egg problem. What comes first? Do we have impurities which impact the grain size? Do we have grain size that impacts the deformation or the CPO, so this orientation of the crystals? And yeah, this has been debated for many, many decades and is still being debated. All right, but to go back to ice cores, this will just simplify and show you what we are working with. So on the left, you can see the bigger scale, and then you zoom in step by step. And the tricky thing is that we, of course, have to cover the meter scale to the micrometer scale. So ice cores are usually 2.5 to maybe 3, maybe 4 kilometers long. So it's really a lot of ice, but we are really also interested in the micro scale, and we go from a lot of visual data to chemical data, and trying to bring all this together is quite challenging sometimes. And one last thing on this, why this is also important, is that we currently have the so-called oldest ice challenge. So there are several deep ice core projects from different nations, different groups, also the Europeans, for example, working on getting a better understanding of the mid-Pleistocene transition, roughly 1 million years ago. And if we look into one core that has been drilled already in Antarctica, finished drilling last year. We assume that we have about 12,000 years in 1 meter at 1.2 million years. So we also need analysis techniques to look at this high resolution to see why has the climate cycles shifted. So they went from a different climate cycle rhythm to the 100 kilo year world that we have now, and we're still not really sure why this happened. Okay, so I just posed some open questions here. It's still not really sure where those impurities are in the mice microstructure, what role they play. So for example, what is the importance of more soluble versus more insoluble impurities? And how does the microstructure impact the climate signal? So those impurities, they are a climate signal, but with all those grain growth and recrystallization processes happening, they of course also impact what we see as a climate signal, and we still don't really understand it well enough to being sure that this climate signal hasn't been altered a lot. And of course, are there chemical reactions happening in ice? Usually you think it's ice, nothing happens there, but it is a very warm material. It's close to its melting point, even though it's very cold for us. But most other materials are much, much more further away from the melting point, and therefore there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of time for reactions to happen. This is also ongoing research. Okay, I'll briefly show you a few instruments that we use. The very first one is the line scan, which you can see here. You can put slabs of 1.65 meter ice on this thing. It's basically a camera, and this is what I showed you already. You zoom or you drive along ice cores that you polished before, and then you get an insight into those layers in the ice. So looks pretty cool, and in the end, you can get a proxy for the dust concentration. So this is a busy plot. In the top, they have measured the dust concentration of an ice core, and the bottom, it's the stable isotopes for temperature. And the middle part is what we get from this line scan, because you get gray and gray values, so black and white, and these correlate very well with the dust concentration. So we can already in the field get an idea where we are, what climatic event are we looking at. Raman spectroscopy is another method that I use a lot during my PhD. So you basically have your ice sample, and then you focus inside your sample on a little dust particle, and you shoot with a laser on it. This particle begins to vibrate, and this vibration can be analyzed, and it gives you a Raman shift. So you get those nice curves, and these help you to identify the mineral that you're looking at. So here on the left, we have this peak at 474, which is a very clear peak for quartz, for example. Tricky thing is you're in the ice, which is great because you don't have to worry about contamination, but you always have the ice signal on top. So this very big peak on the right and the smaller peaks on the left, they are always from the ice. So if you don't get a good signal, it's usually hidden by the ice itself. Okay, another technique is laser ablation, which is coupled to a mass spectrometer. This has been done for roughly 20 years and is now re-emerging again. Very powerful method, and you basically put your sample into this chamber, which is in the middle, this blue thing below the red light. It's chilled, so at below minus 20 degrees. And the principle is that you shoot, again, at the surface of a sample, and you do a grid run, and you shoot plenty of times, so with the frequency of up to 1 kilohertz, and ablate tiny, tiny bits of material, which you can then analyze regarding its chemistry. And this can give you really nice 2D maps of different chemical species and where they are located in the ice microstructure. And with time of flight, which is a certain type of mass spectrometer, you can really analyze the entire mass spectrum without having to choose certain elements first. So this is really cool, and we learn a lot of new stuff these days about rare earth elements, for example. Okay, another one is single particle analysis. This is very chemical or very classic chemical method. So you melt your ice sample. This is the first method I show you here, which really melts the ice, and then you can't use it anymore. So it's usually something we use in the very end. And then you can really analyze millions of particles, again, in the time of flight mass spectrometer, and get the elemental composition. So not the mineral, but the composition of those particles. And this gives you loads of data, which is actually sort of the bottleneck right now, but we still have to get better at working with all those data. But it, yeah, shows you a lot of information from nanoparticles to micrometer sized particles, which again can tell you a lot about the climate of the past. Right, okay, there was quite a lot of technical stuff, so let's move ahead to current challenges, or at least what I would call current challenges. So first I want to take you to Antarctica, to a blue ice area. It's on the image here, on the plot, you can see where it is, close to the American McMurdo station. And blue ice areas are areas that have a lot of ablation, so there's a lot of wind, there's no proper snowfall, and then the snow is being pushed away due to wind if there's actually snowfall, and therefore the ice is sort of being ablated away or eroded away. And if it's close to mountains, like those Allen Hills, the ice can be pushed upwards those mountains, and therefore we get very old ice at very shallow depth. So it flips the entire ice core concept a little bit. That makes it possible to get old ice from shallow locations, and you don't need several years to drill one ice core. This is what it looks like. This is an image from the Allen Hills area in Antarctica. So you can really see why it's called blue ice. It is pretty blue. Okay, there was a big paper coming out a few months ago, and here for LHIG 1901 and LHIG 1902, these are two Allen Hills ice cores. They could show the age, so they can measure the argon in the ice, sorry, and with a ratio of different argon isotopes, you can get the age with a certain uncertainty, of course, but it's still quite reliable. And it's very impressive. They found ice, which is on the left side here, more than 4 million years old. And the very oldest is even almost 7 million years old. So this is by far the oldest ice we have found so far. But the other thing you can see, if you look at the depth scale on the y-axis, you can see that it's not this nice relationship that with depth it gets older, but it's doing this zigzagging. And this is, of course, quite exciting for me because I'm more looking into the microstructure and the deformation of ice, because there's a lot of stuff going on which we still don't understand. So I started to look into this, for example, and I first analyzed air bubbles in the ice, but not the content of those bubbles, but the shape. So we can really measure how thick are those bubbles, how long, and especially how elongated. So what is the shape of those bubbles? And this is just a comparison from another ice core, the Waste Divide ice core, also from Antarctica. And here, just to give you an overview, the most elongated bubble had an aspect ratio. That's just the ratio of those two axes. If you have a bubble, was 3.4. And for Allen Hills, we found bubbles with aspect ratios of above 8. So it's up to 3 times more elongated, and really shows that here a lot of deformation, a lot of ice flow is happening, which is unusual. We also analyzed the fabric or the crystal preferred orientation. So here you can see those colors. You can see those colors in real life if you put a polarized filter below your sample and have some light going through it. And this is just due to the refraction of the ice. So the different ice crystals, if they're orientated differently, the light coming through refracts, and therefore we can see different colors. And it's quite nicely visible that we have those bands of differently orientated ice crystals. So especially on the left one, on the green image, you see that most crystals are orientated towards the green direction. And then we have those two bands where the crystals are more orientated towards the blue direction or the yellowish direction. And this shows us that we have a lot of zones where there's different type of deformation and there's shearing. So different layers sort of in the ice that are being pushed above each other, and this on a very small scale. So you can see the scale bar, this is 1 centimeter. And this is an indicator why we might have those big jumps in the age, because the ice has just been deformed on this very small scale during the past, and it's still deforming probably. Yeah, this is just an explanation. I think I'll skip this. And now I wanted to come back to this oldest ice challenge that I introduced already. So just remember those 12,000 years in 1 meter at 1.2 million years before now. And for this, if we look at laser ablation, so this method that I introduced earlier, we managed to push the technique quite a bit to measure with a 1 micrometer laser spot size. So this is the highest resolution the instrument can do. It looks pretty noisy here, and of course it's not a high resolution image if you really blow it up, but you can really see the difference between 1 micrometer in the middle and, for example, 10 micrometer, which is already a very good resolution. And you can really go into detail here and look on the micrometer scale what is happening on the ice. The downside is it takes a lot of laser shots, a lot of gas that is always going through, so it needs a lot of resources. And you can't do this for every sample. It also takes a long time. So I think just getting this 1 micrometer spot image took about an hour. And yeah, you see the scale is very small. So if you do meters of ice, this is just not feasible. And that's why we are working on a different idea of extending the length of the sample. So not going into higher resolution, but having larger samples, because for now, in general, for laser ablation, the area you were analyzing was usually a few millimeters square, maybe a centimeter times a centimeter, maybe a little bit more if you're lucky. And now Remy here on the right, an engineer, he's really pushing this by developing a new stage where you could put your samples in. I highlighted it here. They can be up to 33 centimeters long. And you can analyze 33 centimeters and put 3 of them on the sample stage, and therefore have 1 meter of ice analyzed in 2 or 3 hours if everything goes great. And here's just an example from a paper that's currently in review. So on top, you can see calcium along a little bit more than 8 centimeters. So the x-axis shows you the sample length. And if you just look at the image, you can really see that there are different layers in the ice, right? This is what I was showing you in the beginning with the visual stratigraphy, with those gray and white and brown images. These layers we can also see in the chemistry with this method very clearly now. And of course, now the tricky thing is, which line do you trust? Because if you look at one single profile, this would be the green line in the bottom plot, you get a certain signal which has a very high resolution at a certain point, but depending on the microstructure where those impurities are, for example, it looks very different than if we look at a smooth profile or if we look at a single profile at a different location. And therefore we tried around a bit. And if you take the entire width of your sample and average this, you get this pink line, which is, at least for now, the best overview profile of what's happening with the chemistry in the ice. But this is all a current challenge. We are still not sure how to really deal with this. Another way to go forward here is to model it. So if you know the grain size of your microstructure of your ice crystals, you can put up a model of the ice and then put impurities into your model, as was done here in this sub-panel B. The yellow, red, orange dots are impurities, highly localized at the grain boundaries in this case. And now we can, in the computer, melt this model and see what kind of signal we would get. So this is all also ongoing work. And we again need the microstructure because this will be our proxy for the location of those impurities and therefore where they are. But it's still not really clear what is really representative, what is feasible from a computer point of view, a lot of things to work on. Okay, and I'm currently working on very deep and old Greenlandic ice. This is the North Grip ice core. And on the left-hand side, you can really see 1 or 2 big ice crystals. So it's again visual stratigraphy image, but those whitish areas are the grain boundaries, and at very deep ice, they are very large. So you can really have crystals of tens of centimeter size. And the issue here now is if the impurities are mainly at the grain boundaries and you take a scan through it, of course, your climate signal will be heavily biased by those large crystals. But in a paper 15 years ago, colleagues here from Copenhagen, they claimed that we can still see an annual layer signal. So you still see in the chemistry each year And this sort of doesn't make sense. And therefore, we're currently trying to look into these samples with laser ablation to see if we can reproduce these results. And it's quite interesting because we already see that those samples, they have been drilled more than 30 years ago. Some have bubbles that appeared in the ice because the pressure is gone from the ice sheet surrounding it, and all the impurities are collecting in the bubbles. And this might, of course, impact your climate signal quite a bit. So it's not sure if they measured the bubbles here, and this is all ongoing and yeah, quite interesting. We'll see in a few months to years. You might know what really happened here. All right, and towards the finish line, I just wanted to show you a few more examples of chemical reactions that are happening in the ice. So here are SEM, secondary electron microscope images you can see, and you have minerals in the ice, and they show coating or some substrates on particles, which are probably indications that we have reactions happening in the ice. And this is also being analyzed at the moment. And here you can also see one very big particle. So it's 1000 micrometers, which is very, very large for ice. And on the right-hand side, you can see different elements which cluster at different locations, showing that these have probably been squeezed together by microstructural processes, for example. And yeah, other people are also working on not fossils, but yeah, maybe you also call them fossils, but biological things in the ice, which can tell us something about the environment when the ice sheet wasn't there. So we see leaves or roots or some things that can tell us what kind of flora and maybe even fauna we have seen hundred thousands to millions of years ago in Greenland and maybe also Antarctica one day. That's a very complicated slide, so I'll just skip it a little bit. But the main message is in this study, they analyze different minerals, and with depth, some of those minerals declined, so all the upper ones, and jarosite, an iron mineral, has increased at a certain depth, and therefore they conclude that those other minerals, they start to weather, so it's a chemical reaction in the ice, creating jarosite, the specific mineral that they only found starting from a certain depth. And by now there's more evidence that this is very, very likely to happen. Okay, now I've been talking a lot. So to finish this, just a very brief and easy take-home message. Ice cores are great as a temperature proxy. CO2 we can analyze with ice cores, we can see volcanic events, and of course also the deformation happening, which I didn't touch in this talk too much, but it's very important too. And especially those microstructure records are getting more and more important because we need this high resolution, and then you just don't get around the small scale anymore. And yeah, the ongoing challenges regarding the oldest ice, which have been now seen to be millions of years old, are still there, and mainly the analysis techniques, but also what to do with these data, how to interpret those records remain a very challenging thing. And maybe some of you got interested and might work on this in the future. So I'm really happy to take questions or hints or notes now. And with this, I would like to finish, and thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk, Nico. That was super interesting. Reminder to the audience that you can send the questions either directly to the chat or you can send them to the questions Fingerprint host. We have already received a few, so I'm just going to drop these in the chat. So the first one is there experimental pressure temperature work being done with ice as well? So similar to experimental mineralogy, or do you mainly work with natural ice from ice sheets?
Right, very good question. There are a few labs worldwide which are doing pressure lab experiments. The main thing, as with other geological materials, is that we can never truly reproduce the time and also the pressure in the ice sheet. So there are experiments, but they mainly run for a few months. If you're lucky, maybe a year. So it's really tricky to get similar results to what we see in an ice sheet. So I only work with natural ice samples. I'd love to get a bit more expertise regarding deformation experiments, for example. but it's very limited. There are worldwide only a few groups who do that. And by now, for example, those orientation plots I showed you where those crystals move towards, we still can't really reproduce the things we see in nature in the lab. So we're still not really understanding all the little details of what's happening. But yeah, very good question. It would be great to have more lab work on this. It's just very expensive and tricky to do.
Yeah, I can imagine that requires quite specialized instrumentation.
Right.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question. Let me post it in the chat. So you kind of touched on this already in the end with the questionable annual layers, but this question asks, what is the temporal resolution of ice cores and how does that change once you go deeper and the ice becomes more compressed?
Yeah. Yeah, as always, it really depends where you are. So we have certain regions where you have a lot of snowfall, especially in Greenland. And there, for the upper 2/3 of the ice column, you have an annual layer of sometimes a few centimeters. So you can really do high analysis studies. You get a seasonal signal even. So you really see when is spring, when is autumn, all those things. And the deeper you go, of course, the more compressed it gets. And in those very old Allen Hills ice samples from those blue ice areas with millions of years, if you look at 10 centimeters, you probably have 100,000 sometimes years in there. So it really varies. And with the normal methods that we use, we have been limited to, let's say, a centimeter, maybe a bit better resolution, mainly over the last years. And now there's really a lot of effort to get below the centimeter resolution, and especially with laser ablation, I think we can look into this in more detail, but it needs more time. It's all in development. It's a lot of ongoing work. So I didn't touch on one method, which is continuous flow analysis. So you just have your ice core and you melt it from the bottom and you just analyze the middle part of it. So it's quite safe regarding contamination. But with this method, you can sort of fast analyze a lot of ice, but you're limited to the centimeter resolution because the melting water mixes and all kinds of processes are happening. But this is sort of the established method, but it's limited to 1 centimeter resolution. And therefore, yeah, we try to get below this, but this requires more time and resources and other things. So yeah, a lot of method development also at the moment.
Yeah, great answer. See that we have a question in the chat from Christopher Harris. He says, thank you for the talk and asks, how does one constrain the accumulation rate of ice? Does it vary significantly between glacial and interglacial periods?
Yeah, good question. It's definitely not my field of expertise. In current days, we try to do this. It's very simple sometimes. You just have a bamboo pole that you put into your location, and then you come back each year and measure how much snow you got. But of course, you can't do this all over the ice sheets. And for past times, which you can analyze in the ice core, you usually use a flow model. So you assume the ice flow over time, and then you sort of correct for several things. And out of this, you can also get the annual layer, the accumulation rate. And yeah, as I said, it varies quite a lot. So especially in this one ice core I'm looking at right now, which is close to the coast, you have a lot of snowfall. So just to give you an example, the core is 580-meter long until bedrock, and 530 meters are just the Holocene, so the last 11.7 thousand years. And then you have the entire glacier in 22 meters. So it's highly compressed, and this has also, of course, to do with different amounts of snowfall and accumulation. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered this completely, but hopefully a little bit.
I think that surely demonstrated it very significantly between glacials and interglacials.
Yeah.
But if Chris, if you want to, oh, Chris says thumbs up. So I guess that was the answer.
Okay, great.
There is another question regarding the impurities. So what is the dominant source of the impurities in the ice? Is it all dust, or do you also find stuff like micrometeorites?
Yeah, also interesting question. I would say the main source is dust, especially in glacial times. And in Greenland, it's mainly from Asian deserts, which come all around through Antarctica, through the United States, Canada to Greenland. In Antarctica, it's mainly Patagonia, a bit of South Africa and Australia. But there are more and more studies showing that it's of course more complicated. So in Greenland, we by now also find a lot of European dust, for example. And then we can also see things like sea salt, and it's been really trying to get better proxy for sea ice coverage over the last hundred thousands of years via impurities in the ice. It's quite tricky, but there are some groups working on that. Micrometeorites, probably, but you might just have missed them. I know that in those blue ice areas in Antarctica, they have been very famous for meteorites because they just add up there and you find them very easily and they get transported back up. So they just cluster in those blue ice areas. But I think you would really have to look very closely to find micrometeorites and maybe you just miss it because, yeah, it's a lot of work to identify those and find them. And of course, there are several people working on tephra and volcanic ash layers in a specific way. So there are different source regions for those impurities.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for your answer. We have two more questions so far, so a reminder to the audience, please send them in the chat to us. Question about a very specific project. Were you also involved in Swice to Sea in some capacity, or will you be working with those data at some point?
No, I wasn't. I'm actually not aware of this. Ways to see.
I think it is a drilling project through the ice on Antarctica.
Okay. I think I know which one it is now. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I didn't mention this. I'm mainly so far only working on the deep ice cores where you drill through the ice sheet. But then, as I showed in the very beginning, we have those ice shelves, so floating tongues of ice, like you can see here. And I think this project, they drilled through the floating ice tongue, this ice shelf, and then through the water into the bedrock below. I think that was the special idea of this project, if I'm not completely wrong now, which is quite cool because we don't know much about the bedrock around Antarctica. But no, I wasn't involved. But yeah, I should look up what actually happened to that project. Sounded pretty cool. And yeah, maybe just a little remark. So in general, this ice core community is very small. So worldwide, there are a few hundred people working on this. So you usually know the big projects, those lighthouse projects, but then most nations or communities try to have smaller projects on the side, which have a very specific idea, like drilling through an ice shelf here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. You put it like that, drilling through the ice in the bedrock is quite different from drilling into the ice sheet itself.
Right, and drilling into bedrock again is very tricky because you have to take a different drill. You have lots of things that could go wrong. You don't really see what's going on below. So usually, if you drill an ice core and then in the end you change to a different drill setup, different drill bits and kinds of pieces, and if you're lucky, you get a few centimeters of very small core. So it's quite crazy how much effort it is to get a bit of bedrock sample.
Yeah, it's all very technically complex to me, working in these environments.
Yeah.
Let's see. So far, we have one more question, but I think it might be a nice one to end the Q&A with. So, if you could select one new drill site for an ice core, where would it be?
Ooh, yeah, good question. That's actually a very big debate at the moment because we've sort of have the oldest ice now from Antarctica. hopefully, which answers a lot of questions. The project I was involved in that I started with in Greenland, East Grip, was through a moving ice stream. So we have areas of ice sheets which move much faster than the surrounding ice, and we still don't understand the physics behind that. And that's probably for me the most interesting aspect, to have something similar like this, maybe in Antarctica. Yeah, but it's also in the community, it's really not clear what the next big thing will be. So also logistically and politically, it gets a bit tricky here and there. So it is a very big open question. At the moment, I really wouldn't know for sure, to be honest. And on the other hand, we have so much ice still lying in freezers, and sometimes in Antarctica even still to work with. So also from a climate perspective, maybe it also makes sense to slow down on the drilling and invest a bit more into the analyses, and then have a bit of a better, more profound idea what is really needed for the next big project. But yeah, something that I'm definitely thinking about and trying to come up with a good idea.
Yeah, thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense.
Welcome.
I just had one, if you don't mind, one quick question for me.
Sure.
Is there any overlap with Lisa's community of mountain glaciers, or is this something that's really completely different in the the pressure is so different, I guess, in the movement as well?
Right. It's an interesting history also. I mean, most ice core research started in the Alps in Europe and then moved on to more remote places. And at least what I can say, it is sort of separated, that you have the polar ice core scientists and then the more alpine focused ice core scientists. But of course, for several processes, especially regarding snow and ferns or those upper layers, there's a lot of overlap. But the main difference is probably the age. So glaciers from the Alps, they are a few thousand years old. If they are old, maybe 10,000. That's probably among the oldest. There's a lot of work going on from China and India in the Himalayas, which is again a little sub-community. But I think it's moving more and more towards really coming together a bit more, because there have been some big projects that have been collecting ice cores from the ice sheets, but also from mountain glaciers, and collecting them from the future, because especially those mountain glaciers, they will be gone in a few years sometimes. So there is exchange and overlap, but then again, some of the scientific questions are very different. So in the Alps, it's, for example, more regarding water availability, floods, industrial revolution impact directly on the ice and then thus on the water, while those polar ice cores are really more about the long-term climate history, at least what we call long-term from ice core sciences. So it's a bit of both, I'd say. Depends a bit on the people you work with, but I think there could still be a bit more collaboration and exchange here and there for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine the questions are quite different, but then again, you both work on the same material, so it makes sense that there is some kind of overlap.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, if there is no questions anymore, I would like to thank Nico again for this super interesting talk and the Q&A. Before we go into tea time, I will quickly share if a comment, very interesting and clear presentation. I very much agree with that.
Thank you.
I will share some information about next week's talk. Is this working? Yes. So again, thanks everyone for joining us, especially those that don't stay for tea time. I hope to see you next week on June 30th, the same time, UTC 15 o'clock. And we will be joined by Victoria Harris from the University of Iowa in the US, who will be giving a talk about dendrochronology. And again, a reminder to fill out the feedback form in the chat if you want to. Then we move into tea time. For those of you that don't know, tea time is just an informal conversation about the talk with the speaker where we stop the recording and everyone can turn on their cameras and their microphones. Especially if you want to chat about other aspects of Nico's work, or if you have a more technical question, then please stick around. But first, we have a little 2-minute break just to give everyone time to breathe, especially our speaker. So those of you that are not sticking around for tea time, hopefully see you next week. And those of you that are, I will see you in 2 minutes.